The story of the B-36 Peacemaker feels less like the biography of a machine and more like the life of a giant born into an anxious world, a world that had just discovered nuclear fire and was still deciding what to do with it. The aircraft did not simply emerge from blueprints in factories. It arrived as a response to fear, ambition, and the uneasy silence that followed the Second World War. Every rivet carried intention. Every engine hum carried tension. And every takeoff seemed to ask the same unspoken question: how far must humanity go to feel safe? When people describe the B-36 as the largest mass-produced piston engine aircraft ever to fly, the phrase often sounds like a statistic, something impressive but distant. Yet numbers alone cannot capture its presence. Standing beneath its wings was like standing beside a moving building. The shadow it cast on the runway felt unnatural, as if the sky itself had decided to lower a ceiling. Mechanics would look up and see not just an airplane, but an enormous promise and an enormous responsibility.
The operational life of the B-36 unfolded during the early years of the Cold War, a time when uncertainty was not a headline, but a daily atmosphere. Nations were no longer simply rebuilding. They were quietly measuring one another, calculating reach, speed, and destructive potential. In this climate, the United States needed something unprecedented, an aircraft capable of crossing oceans without stopping, carrying weapons so heavy and so decisive that the mere knowledge of their existence could influence diplomacy. The B-36 became that answer, not sleek, not elegant, but overwhelming in scale and intent. Its engineering was a study in bold decisions, the kind that only appear when the stakes are immense. To lift a payload that bordered on absurd, designers embraced a propulsion configuration that sounded almost poetic, despite its brutality. 6 turning, 4 burning. 6 massive radial piston engines pushed the aircraft forward from behind the wings, their propellers facing backward in a pusher arrangement that reduced drag and improved efficiency at high altitude. Later variants added 4 jet engines beneath the wings, giving the bomber an extra surge of speed when it was most needed. It was not merely an engine setup, it was a compromise between eras, half rooted in the propeller age, half reaching toward the jet future. But brilliance rarely arrives without complications. The pusher configuration, while aerodynamically clever, made cooling difficult and maintenance exhausting. Engines overheated, oil leaked, spark plugs demanded constant attention. A single B-36 could require hundreds of hours of work before and after each mission, turning hangars into arenas of endless motion where crews climbed ladders, checked gauges, wiped grease from their hands, and repeated the process again and again. The aircraft was powerful, yes, but it was also hungry for time, manpower, and patience. Inside the aircraft, another world existed, one that few outside aviation ever truly imagined. Missions could stretch beyond a full day, sometimes approaching 30 hours or more. The crew did not simply sit in seats. They inhabited the bomber. Pressurized compartments allowed them to survive at extreme altitudes, where the air thinned to near nothing. A narrow tunnel connected the forward and rear sections, and crew members would lie on small wheeled carts to slide through the metal passage, drifting between stations like travelers moving through the spine of a mechanical whale. Bunks, work areas, and communication posts created an interior that resembled a submarine more than an airplane. The B-36 was not just flown, it was lived in, endured, and shared. Weight reduction became an obsession, and magnesium found its way into the airframe as a solution. Lighter than many traditional materials, it allowed engineers to shave precious pounds from the structure. Yet this choice introduced its own dangers. Magnesium was prone to corrosion and, under certain conditions, could burn with ferocity. The aircraft thus became a delicate balance between innovation and risk, a reminder that progress often walks a narrow line between triumph and vulnerability. Maintenance crews learned to respect the bomber with a mixture of admiration and fatigue. Each inspection was a ritual. Each repair felt like tending to a colossal organism rather than fixing a machine. The scent of oil, the metallic clang of tools, and the constant drone of engines warming up formed a soundtrack that defined the B-36's ground life. It was not glamorous work, but it was essential. The invisible labor that kept the giant breathing. Strategically, the B-36 occupied a role that extended far beyond its physical structure. It became a symbol, a flying statement of reach and resolve.
During the early Cold War, its existence alone influenced global calculations. The aircraft could carry the immense Mark 17 hydrogen bomb without refueling, a capability unmatched at the time. That single fact granted it a unique place in history. It was not merely an option in military planning, it was a reassurance to allies and a warning to adversaries. Ironically, its greatest success lay in what it never did. The B-36 never dropped a bomb in combat. Its power resided in deterrence and the quiet understanding that it could, if ever called upon. Development was far from smooth. Engineers experimented with unusual solutions to unprecedented problems. One of the most striking was the tracked landing gear concept, designed to distribute the bomber's enormous weight and prevent runways from crumbling under pressure. Though ultimately impractical, such experiments revealed the extent to which the B-36 pushed infrastructure to its limits. Airfields had to adapt. Logistics had to expand. Even the ground beneath the aircraft had to prove strong enough to bear its presence. Despite its achievements, time moved swiftly. Jet technology matured, refueling techniques improved, and a new generation of bombers emerged. The B-52, faster and more efficient, represented the future that the B-36 had only partially anticipated. Gradually, the piston jet hybrid stepped aside, not in disgrace, but in quiet acknowledgement that its era had passed. The giant that once defined strategic aviation became a transitional figure, a bridge between what aviation had been and what it was becoming. Yet the legacy of the B-36 endures precisely because it existed at that crossroads. It demonstrated what determination and engineering audacity could accomplish when necessity demanded the impossible. It revealed the limits of technology even as it expanded them. It showed that deterrence could be achieved not only through action, but through presence. And perhaps most importantly, it reminded the world that machines are reflections of the times that create them. Looking back, the B-36 Peacemaker feels almost mythical, a creature of aluminum, magnesium, and thunderous engines that rose from runways and disappeared into the high atmosphere, carrying with it the hopes and anxieties of a generation. It was imperfect, demanding, and often troublesome, yet undeniably extraordinary. Its story is not simply about aviation history. It is about the human urge to reach farther, build bigger, and confront uncertainty with ingenuity. In the end, the B-36 did not define victory or defeat. It defined a moment, a brief but powerful chapter, when the sky seemed large enough to hold both fear and ambition at once, and when a single aircraft could embody the weight of an entire era's expectation. There is something almost paradoxical about the B-36 Peacemaker. It was built to prepare for a war that everyone hoped would never happen. Unlike fighters that chased glory in dogfights or bombers that etched their names into the scars of cities, the B-36 existed in a quieter realm, one defined by patrol routes, readiness drills, and long hours of waiting. Its victories were invisible. Its missions were measured not in explosions, but in the absence of them. In a strange way, its greatest achievement was the silence it helped preserve. The men who flew it often described a relationship with the aircraft that felt personal. Pilots did not merely control the B-36, they negotiated with it. Taxiing such a massive machine demanded patience and finesse. The controls responded with a slight delay, as though the aircraft were considering each command before obeying. Takeoff runs stretched on, engines roaring in layered harmony, the deep, rhythmic thunder of pistons mixed with the sharper scream of jets. When the bomber finally lifted off, the sensation was less like leaping into the sky and more like persuading gravity to loosen its grip for a moment. Altitude was its domain. High above commercial air traffic and weather disturbances, the B-36 cruised in the thin upper atmosphere where the horizon curved subtly and the world below became an abstract map of colors and shapes. From those heights, cities were mere clusters of light, oceans looked like sheets of dark glass, and clouds formed silent mountain ranges. The crew would spend hours suspended between Earth and space, wrapped in the steady vibration of engines and the muted hum of instruments. Time behaved differently there. Minutes stretched. Conversations drifted. Fatigue crept in quietly, like a slow-moving tide. Life on board required discipline and routine. Crew rotations ensured that no one remained at a single station too long. Meals were simple, often reheated in cramped compartments where the smell of coffee mingled with warm metal and recycled air. The narrow tunnel connecting the front and rear sections became both a passageway and a symbol, a reminder that even within a machine of such scale, space could still feel confined. Sliding through that tube on a small cart, a crew member might feel suspended between two worlds, neither fully forward nor fully aft, just drifting through the hollow center of a mechanical leviathan. Weather posed its own challenges. At lower altitudes, storms could buffet the aircraft with unsettling force, but at the extreme heights the B-36 preferred, another danger emerged. Cold so intense it seemed to seep into the structure itself. Frost formed on surfaces. Instruments required constant monitoring. The aircraft, vast as it was, could still feel fragile when surrounded by endless sky and biting temperatures. Pilots learned to read not only their gauges, but also the subtle moods of the atmosphere, interpreting turbulence and wind shear as if deciphering a language spoken only at altitude. On the ground, the aircraft inspired a different kind of awe. Children who saw it at air shows would tilt their heads back until their necks ached, unable to grasp how something so large could fly. Veterans who worked beside it remembered the echo of footsteps beneath its wings and the way sunlight reflected off its polished skin like a mirror to another era. Photographs rarely captured its true scale, only standing nearby revealed how small a person seemed in comparison. The B-36 did not just occupy space, it redefined it. Yet for all its size and strength, the bomber was also vulnerable to the relentless march of progress. Jet engines grew more reliable. Aerodynamics evolved. Military strategy shifted towards speed and flexibility rather than sheer range and payload. The world that had demanded the B-36 began to change, and with that change came new priorities. Retirement did not arrive with ceremony alone. It came with a quiet understanding that the giant had served its purpose. One by one, the aircraft were decommissioned, their thunderous departures replaced by the sharper, cleaner roar of all jet successors. What remains today is not merely metal preserved in museums, but a memory of ambition shaped into wings. The B-36 Peacemaker represents a chapter when engineers dared to build beyond comfort, when nations invested faith in technology as both shield and statement. It reminds us that history is not always written by battles fought, but also by conflicts avoided and tensions held at bay through presence alone. To reflect on the B-36 is to reflect on a period when humanity stood at the edge of unprecedented power and searched for balance. The aircraft was never meant to be beautiful, yet in its enormity there was a strange elegance, the elegance of purpose, of scale aligned with necessity. It flew not to dominate the skies in combat, but to occupy them with intent. And in doing so, it became more than a bomber. It became a monument to an age defined by caution, courage, and the enduring belief that sometimes the most important action is simply being prepared. As the years passed and the B-36 slowly disappeared from active service, its presence did not vanish all at once. Instead, it faded the way a distant engine fades in the sky. First loud and undeniable, then softer, then finally just a memory you are not entirely sure you truly heard. Air bases that once echoed with its layered thunder grew quieter. Hangars that had been built wide and tall to shelter its wings began to feel oversized, almost hollow, like rooms waiting for a guest who would never return. For the crews who had lived alongside the aircraft, retirement was not merely a procedural change. It felt personal. Many of them had spent years climbing its ladders, memorizing the rhythm of its engines, trusting its bulk to carry them across oceans and back again. When the B-36 was grounded for the last time, it was as if a familiar companion had stepped out of the room without saying goodbye. The newer jets were faster, sharper, undeniably more advanced. But they did not carry the same sense of enormity, the same feeling that one was participating in something almost architectural rather than aerodynamic. In museums, the surviving peacemakers became silent storytellers. Visitors walk beneath their wings and instinctively slow down, voices dropping to a respectful hush. The polished aluminum reflects overhead lights like frozen sunlight, and the fuselage stretches on longer than the eye first expects. Children often ask how it could possibly fly. Adults, meanwhile, tend to stand quietly for a moment, imagining the world that required such a machine to exist. The aircraft no longer roars, yet its silence speaks just as loudly. It tells of an era when technology was both a promise and a warning, when size itself was a strategic language. The legacy of the B-36 also lives in the lessons it left behind. Engineers learned that pushing boundaries often reveals not only new possibilities, but also hidden costs. Maintenance complexity, logistical strain, and the human limits of endurance all became clearer through the bomber's service. Future aircraft benefited from those lessons, becoming more efficient, more streamlined, more sustainable in the long run. In that sense, the B-36 was not just a product of its time. It was a teacher to the future, a stepping stone disguised as a giant. There is also a philosophical echo to its story. The Peacemaker was built with the intention of preventing catastrophe through preparedness. It carried within its vast bomb bays the potential for unimaginable destruction, yet its true mission was to ensure those weapons would never need to be used. This duality gives the aircraft a peculiar emotional weight. It was both shield and shadow, protector and reminder. Few machines embody such contradictions so clearly, and fewer still manage to do so without ever firing a shot in anger. When historians look back, they often describe the B-36 as a bridge, not only between piston and jet technology, but between two mindsets. One was rooted in the industrial might of the Second World War, where bigger often meant better. The other was moving toward agility, speed, and precision, hallmarks of the jet age that followed. The Peacemaker stood firmly in the middle, 1 foot in each world, carrying the DNA of both. That in-between identity is part of what makes it so fascinating. It was never entirely of one era or the other, and therefore it belongs uniquely to history itself. Even today, decades after its final flight, the idea of the B-36 still captures imagination. It appears in documentaries, archival footage, and conversations among aviation enthusiasts who speak of it with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. The aircraft feels almost unreal when described. 6 piston engines pushing, 4 jets burning, wings stretching wider than many city streets. And yet it was real, undeniably real, once lifting itself into the sky with a determination that seemed to defy common sense. In the end, the B-36 Peacemaker endures not because of battles fought or victories claimed, but because of what it represented, the willingness of humanity to confront uncertainty with ingenuity on a grand scale. It was a monument made of metal and motion, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful statements are not delivered through action, but through presence. Long after its engines fell silent, the echo of its purpose continues, a quiet testament to an age when the sky was both a frontier and a mirror, reflecting the fears, hopes, and ambitions of the people who dared to fill it. And perhaps that is why the B-36 Peacemaker continues to linger in conversations long after its last flight, not as a relic frozen in aluminum, but as a question that never fully disappears. What does it mean to build something so immense, so demanding, purely to ensure it is never used? The aircraft forces us to look at technology not only as a tool, but as a reflection of collective emotion. Fear shaped its wings just as much as engineering did. Hope filled its fuel tanks as surely as aviation gasoline ever could. In photographs from the 1950s, the bomber often appears surrounded by tiny human figures, mechanics, pilots, officers, all dwarfed by the fuselage. Yet those small silhouettes were the true center of the story. The B-36 did not fly itself. It relied on hands that tightened bolts in winter winds, on eyes that stayed open through long night shifts, on minds that calculated distances across continents with slide rules and quiet determination. The machine was monumental, but the people were the heartbeat that gave it motion. There is also something deeply symbolic in how the aircraft aged. Metal fatigued, paint weathered, engines required more care. It did not crumble suddenly, it simply grew older, the way all ambitious creations eventually do. Each retirement ceremony, each final landing, felt less like an ending and more like a gentle acknowledgement that time had moved forward. Progress rarely pauses to say thank you, yet the B-36 earned a quiet respect simply by having carried such a heavy responsibility without ever unleashing its full destructive potential. For many historians, the Peacemaker represents a turning point where aviation stopped chasing only altitude or speed and began grappling with consequence. The bomber was not just about how far humanity could fly, but about how far humanity was willing to go. Its enormous bomb bays and intercontinental reach were technological feats, yes, but they also served as moral mirrors. They asked uncomfortable questions about power, restraint, and the fragile balance between security and escalation. Today, when people stand beneath a preserved B-36 in a museum, the experience often feels strangely intimate, despite the aircraft's size. The silence invites imagination. One can almost hear the layered drone of engines warming up, feel the faint vibration through the floor. Picture the crew preparing for a mission measured not in minutes, but in entire days. Yet the stillness remains. The aircraft no longer moves, and in that stillness lies its final message. It existed so that movement, the movement toward war, might be avoided. In the broader arc of history, the B-36 Peacemaker is less a weapon and more a monument to a particular human mindset, a moment when the world stood at the edge of unprecedented capability and chose, at least for a time, restraint. Its wings once stretched across the sky like a declaration of reach. Now they stretch across memory like a reminder of responsibility. The engines are silent. The runways it once dominated have long since welcomed sleeker successors. Yet the essence of the B-36 endures. It survives in stories, in archival film, in the quiet awe of museum visitors, and in the enduring fascination with how close humanity once came to redefining the limits of flight and power at the same time. And perhaps that is its true legacy. Not the thunder it created, but the echoes it left behind. Echoes of ambition, caution, and the enduring hope that sometimes the greatest strength lies in never having to prove it. Over time, the B-36 Peacemaker drifted from living memory into a kind of mechanical legend, not because it vanished, but because it outgrew the era that had once demanded its existence. New aircraft arrived with sharper silhouettes and louder promises, yet none quite carried the same gravity. The Peacemaker had been conceived in a moment when the sky itself felt uncertain, when distance was both a barrier and a challenge, and when nations measured security in miles of range rather than minutes of response. What makes the B-36 enduring is not only its engineering scale, but the emotional atmosphere wrapped around it. The aircraft belonged to a generation that believed size could equal safety, that reach could prevent conflict, that showing capability might be enough to avoid using it. In that sense, the Peacemaker was less an instrument of aggression and more a silent negotiator, a presence that hovered in calculations and conversations, even when it never left the runway. There is a quiet poetry in how such machines transition from utility to memory. During its active years, the bomber was defined by noise, pistons beating like distant thunder, jets screaming in bursts of urgency, metal structures trembling with life. Decades later, the same aircraft rests behind museum ropes in near absolute silence. The contrast is striking. Visitors walk around it slowly, almost instinctively respectful, as though sound itself would feel inappropriate. The absence of motion becomes its own narrative, one that whispers about responsibility rather than dominance. For those who study aviation history, the B-36 represents a rare convergence of extremes. It was at once advanced and outdated, revolutionary and transitional. Its hybrid propulsion system bridged two technological ages, its sheer mass-forced infrastructure, logistics, and human endurance to stretch in ways few other aircraft ever demanded. It was not efficient by later standards, nor was it graceful in the traditional sense, but it achieved something subtler.
For fortunate street you began to steamy up to 82 Finavinier and from this circle at the 3 sequence of what I developed no one there like you but it and just broke so long you
There is also a human dimension that lingers long after the specifications fade. The crews who served aboard the Peacemaker carried stories of endless horizons, frozen windows at altitude, and the strange intimacy of sharing a metal world for entire days. Their experiences were not cinematic dogfights or explosive encounters. They were long, quiet stretches of vigilance. That endurance shaped a different kind of heroism, one rooted in patience, discipline, and the acceptance that sometimes the most critical missions are the ones no one ever hears about. As history moves forward, the B-36 becomes less a chapter and more a mirror. It reflects a time when humanity grappled with newfound power and searched for equilibrium. Its immense wings once symbolized reach across continents. Now they symbolize the weight of decisions carried across generations. The aircraft reminds us that technology is never neutral. It inherits the fears, hopes, and philosophies of the people who build it. In the end, the Peacemaker's story does not conclude with retirement dates or replacement models. It continues in the quiet curiosity of those who stand beneath its wings, in the archival footage where its engines still rumble across black and white skies, and in the broader understanding that progress is rarely linear. Some creations are not meant to dominate forever. They are meant to exist precisely when they are needed most, then step aside with dignity. And so the B-36 remains not roaring across the stratosphere, but gliding through memory, a reminder that the greatest machines are not always those that change the world through action, but those that change it simply by being there, when history required their presence. With each passing decade, the B-36 Peacemaker settles deeper into that rare space where engineering turns into folklore. It is no longer judged by performance charts or maintenance logs. Instead, it lives in recollections, in grainy footage, in the quiet astonishment of people who discover its dimensions for the first time. The aircraft has become less an object and more an atmosphere, a presence that seems to hover between memory and imagination. What often surprises modern audiences is how deliberate everything about the B-36 was. Nothing about it felt casual or accidental. Its wings were not merely wide, they were statements of reach. Its engines were not simply powerful, they were declarations of endurance. Even its imperfections tell a story. The oil leaks, the endless inspections, the stubborn mechanical quirks, these details reveal the human side of technological ambition. They show that progress is rarely smooth, that greatness frequently arrives with friction attached. There is also a subtle shift in how we interpret the bomber today. During its operational years, it was viewed through the lens of necessity and tension. Now, distance softens that tension into reflection. We see it not as a looming instrument of deterrence, but as a monument to a particular mindset, a time when the world stood on uncertain ground and chose to build something enormous in order to feel steadier. The B-36 becomes a lesson in perspective, how fear can inspire innovation, and how innovation can, in turn, shape history without ever firing a shot. In museums, the aircraft often appears suspended in perpetual readiness. Its landing gear is fixed, its propellers still, yet there is an illusion that it might awaken at any moment. Visitors walk along its length and notice small details, rivet lines, faded insignias, the curvature of glass in the cockpit, and suddenly the bomber feels less abstract. It transforms from a statistic into a story. You begin to imagine the crews climbing aboard, the engines warming, the slow roll toward the runway. The mind fills the silence with echoes. Another reason the Peacemaker endures is its symbolism of transition. It stands at the threshold between two eras of flight, the muscular confidence of piston power and the sleek certainty of jet propulsion. Few machines embody that shift so clearly. It is both culmination and prologue, an ending and a beginning fused into one airframe. Because of this, it resists simple categorization. It is neither purely old nor purely modern. It is a reminder that history often advances through hybrids, through moments where past and future overlap. Beyond technology, the B-36 also represents a quieter human truth, the desire to control uncertainty. Nations built it to extend their reach, but individuals maintained it to protect their sense of stability. Every bolt tightened, every engine tested, every checklist completed was an act of reassurance. The aircraft was massive, but the motivation behind it was deeply personal, the hope that preparedness could keep catastrophe at a distance. As time moves on, fewer people remember the sound of its engines firsthand. Yet the fascination does not fade. If anything, it grows more contemplative. The B-36 becomes a symbol of scale, not only physical scale, but emotional and historical scale as well. It reminds us that certain creations are not meant to dominate the future, they are meant to define a moment so completely that the moment itself becomes unforgettable. And perhaps that is where the Peacemaker finds its final form. Not in the sky and not on the runway, but in the collective imagination, a vast silhouette stretching across decades, whispering of ambition, caution, and the peculiar beauty of a machine built to ensure it would never need to prove its power. Eventually, the B-36 Peacemaker reaches a point in memory where it is no longer just remembered, it is interpreted. Each generation looks at it through a slightly different lens. To those who lived beside it, it was routine, responsibility, and relentless schedules. To later historians, it became a technological milestone. To younger audiences discovering it for the first time, it almost feels fictional, as if someone exaggerated the dimensions of an airplane until it crossed into myth. Yet the truth remains unchanged. It was real, it flew, and it carried with it the emotional weight of an entire era. What deepens its legend is the contrast between its physical enormity and the quietness of its purpose. The B-36 was designed to be decisive, yet its success was measured by restraint. This inversion fascinates people because it runs against instinct. Most machines are built to be used. This one was built so that it would not have to be. The paradox gives the aircraft a philosophical presence, turning it from a military asset into a symbol of balance, fragile, imperfect, but necessary at the time. There is also a certain humility hidden within its story. Despite its massive wingspan and formidable payload, the B-36 did not usher in a permanent age of giant bombers. Instead, it yielded to progress. Faster jets arrived, strategies evolved, and the skies changed character. Rather than clinging to dominance, the Peacemaker became a stepping stone. Its retirement was less a fall from relevance and more a quiet handover, like an elder passing knowledge to a successor. In this way, its dignity lies not only in what it achieved, but in how it stepped aside. The aircraft's physical remains, those preserved in museums or archives, serve as anchors for imagination. Visitors often circle them slowly, noticing how the fuselage seems to stretch farther than expected, how the landing gear looks strong enough to hold a building, how the cockpit windows feel surprisingly small for such a colossal frame. Standing near it invites a peculiar mix of awe and introspection. One begins to sense the scale of decisions that once surrounded it, the invisible calculations of distance, risk, and consequence that defined its mission. Beyond engineering and strategy, the B-36 ultimately tells a human story about thresholds. It emerged at the threshold between war and uneasy peace, between propellers and jets, between fear and cautious optimism. It represents that suspended moment when the future is not yet clear and the present demands bold solutions. In hindsight, the aircraft becomes a reminder that progress is often built in layers, that what seems excessive or transitional in one decade may become essential groundwork for the next. As decades continue to pass, the Peacemaker's engines remain silent, but its narrative continues to move. It glides through documentaries, books, conversations, and quiet reflections, always carrying the same underlying message that technology is never separate from the emotions and intentions that shape it. The B-36 was metal and fuel, yes, but it was also belief, caution, and the determination to stand prepared without crossing the line into destruction. In the end, the aircraft does not linger because of speed records or combat victories. It lingers because it captures a rare equilibrium, a moment when humanity built something immense, not to conquer the sky, but to steady itself beneath it. Its wings, once stretched across continents, now stretch across memory, reminding us that some machines are remembered not for the noise they made, but for the silence they helped preserve. As the narrative stretches further into reflection, the B-36 Peacemaker begins to feel less like a machine that once existed and more like a horizon that history briefly touched. It belongs to that category of creations that seem too large for their own time, yet perfectly shaped by it. When people think about the aircraft today, they are rarely picturing a single mission or a specific year. Instead, they imagine an atmosphere, vast skies, distant runways, crews moving with quiet precision, and the constant awareness that the world had changed forever. What gives the B-36 its enduring resonance is the sense that it carried more than fuel and metal. It carried intention. Every flight represented preparation rather than aggression, vigilance rather than confrontation. The bomber did not rush toward conflict. It loomed at the edge of it, like a mountain seen from afar. This restrained posture turned the aircraft into something unusual in military history, a presence defined not by what it destroyed, but by what it discouraged. There is also a quiet beauty in how the Peacemaker symbolizes scale beyond numbers. Its wingspan, its payload, its range, all of these statistics are impressive, yet they only hint at the deeper scale it embodied. It represented the scale of human anxiety in the early nuclear age, the scale of technological ambition, the scale of responsibility placed upon engineers and crews who understood that their work existed in the shadow of unimaginable consequences. The aircraft became a physical expression of emotions that were otherwise invisible. Over time, the B-36 has transformed into a kind of historical landmark without borders. Unlike monuments carved in stone or bronze, its legacy moves through stories and recollections. One generation remembers the sound of its engines rolling across airfields. Another knows it through photographs and archival film. A newer generation encounters it through documentaries and articles, often reacting with disbelief that such a colossal piston-powered aircraft truly took to the sky. Each perspective adds another layer, turning the bomber into a shared memory rather than a fixed artifact. Perhaps the most compelling aspect of its story is how it illustrates transition. The B-36 did not belong fully to the past or the future. It stood between them. It carried the mechanical confidence of propeller aviation while hinting at the jet-driven velocity that would soon dominate the skies. In doing so, it reminds us that progress is rarely a clean break. More often, it is a bridge wide, complex, and sometimes awkward that allows one era to walk into the next. In quiet moments of reflection, the Peacemaker feels almost philosophical. It prompts questions about the relationship between power and restraint, innovation and consequence, scale and intention. It suggests that technology is never purely technical. It is shaped by the fears and hopes of the societies that build it. The aircraft's silence today speaks just as clearly as its engines once did. Where there was once thunder, there is now contemplation. And so the B-36 continues to drift through collective memory like a distant silhouette against a fading sky. It no longer defines strategy or headlines, yet it retains a subtle gravity. It reminds us that some creations are not remembered for their victories, but for the balance they helped maintain. In the vast timeline of aviation, the Peacemaker stands as a quiet testament to a moment when humanity built something enormous, not simply to reach farther, but to steady itself, to look at the horizon, measure the distance, and choose caution alongside capability. In the final stretch of its story, the B-36 Peacemaker almost stops being an aircraft altogether and becomes a metaphor, a symbol shaped from aluminum and ambition, lifted into the sky by engines and by emotion in equal measure. Its physical form belonged to the mid-20th century, but its meaning stretches far beyond those years. It represents a period when humanity discovered that technological power could grow faster than wisdom, and that sometimes the only way to balance that growth was through restraint rather than action. What makes the Peacemaker unforgettable is not merely its dimensions or specifications, but the quiet tension it carried wherever it flew. It was a machine designed for extremes, yet tasked with preventing the ultimate extreme from ever occurring. That contradiction gave it a strange dignity. It was neither hero nor villain, neither triumphant nor tragic. Instead, it existed in the narrow space between, the space where preparation meets uncertainty, and where presence itself becomes a form of influence. As decades layered themselves over its history, the aircraft gradually shed its operational identity and gained a reflective one. People no longer asked how fast it could climb or how far it could fly. They began asking what it represented. In that shift, the B-36 transformed from a technical marvel into a cultural echo. It started to symbolize the moment when the world realized that the sky was no longer just a frontier of exploration, but also a ceiling of responsibility. There is a gentle irony in how its story concludes. The bomber that once demanded so much attention, vast runways, endless maintenance, entire crews devoted to its readiness, now rests quietly, asking nothing of anyone. Its engines, once thunderous, are frozen in stillness. Its wings, once instruments of deterrence, are now simply shapes casting museum shadows. And yet, despite the silence, it continues to communicate. It reminds observers that history is not only driven by events that happen, but also by the events that are prevented. In many ways, the Peacemaker teaches a subtle lesson about scale. Bigger is not always louder. Greater power does not always lead to greater action. Sometimes scale exists to hold something back rather than to push it forward. The aircraft's legacy lies in this understanding that magnitude can serve caution just as easily as conquest, and that restraint can be as historically significant as victory. So the narrative of the B-36 does not end with its final flight or its retirement date. It ends in a quieter place, one made of memory and interpretation rather than metal and fuel. It lingers as an outline against the sky of history, a reminder that the most influential machines are not always those that change the world through force, but those that help the world pause, reconsider, and choose a steadier path. In the end, the Peacemaker remains true to its name in the most unexpected way, and did not make peace through negotiation or ceremony. It made peace by existing, by standing ready, by stretching its immense wings across possibility, and by proving that sometimes the strongest statement a civilization can make is not the noise of power, but the discipline of silence. And after all the engines have cooled, after the last crew has stepped down the ladder and the final logbook has been closed, what remains of the B-36 Peacemaker is something quieter than metal and longer lasting than sound. It becomes a memory that does not belong to any single nation or decade, but to the broader human story of how we grapple with power once we discover it. The aircraft no longer occupies airspace, it occupies thought. It is recalled not for the wars it fought, but for the wars it stood ready to prevent. In this late echo of its existence, the Peacemaker feels almost like a question suspended in the sky. How large must our creations become before we learn the weight of them? Its vast wings once stretched across continents in potential, now they stretch across imagination. People no longer measure its range in miles, but in meaning. It becomes a reminder that engineering can be both a mirror and a warning, a reflection of what we are capable of building, and a caution about why we build it. There is a certain tenderness in that transformation. Machines are often remembered for action, speed records, victories, dramatic moments of impact. The B-36 is remembered for presence. It teaches that influence does not always require motion. Sometimes it is enough to exist visibly, convincingly, responsibly. In a world that often celebrates noise and spectacle, the Peacemaker's legacy is rooted in restraint, in the discipline of preparedness without escalation. As generations continue to pass, fewer people will recall the actual vibration of its engines or the specific smell of oil on cold morning runways. Yet the essence of the aircraft endures because it speaks to something universal, the tension between capability and choice. It reminds us that progress is not merely the accumulation of speed or power, but the wisdom to decide when not to use them. In that sense, the B-36 outlives its era by embodying a principle rather than a performance. Eventually, the story reaches a calm horizon. The bomber is no longer an object of urgency or debate. It settles into the background of history like a distant mountain, always there, rarely dominating the view, yet quietly shaping the landscape of understanding. It stands as proof that some achievements are measured not by the change they cause, but by the change they help avoid. And so the narrative closes not with a roar, but with a hush. The B-36 Peacemaker fades into the vast archive of human endeavor, leaving behind an unusual legacy, a giant remembered for its silence, a weapon remembered for its restraint, a machine remembered for the peace it helped maintain simply by being ready. In that paradox lies its enduring power, the realization that sometimes the most profound mark on history is made not by what we do, but by what we choose not to unleash. Beyond that quiet horizon, the B-36 Peacemaker no longer moves through history as an aircraft at all. It moves as an idea. The metal has aged. The runways have changed. The skies it once crossed are filled with entirely different machines, yet the meaning it carried continues to travel. It becomes one of those rare creations that outlive their function and slip into symbolism, where engineering turns into reflection and scale turns into philosophy. In this final layer of memory, the Peacemaker feels almost weightless despite the immense tonnage it once demanded from the Earth. The roar that once defined it has dissolved into silence, and that silence becomes its most enduring characteristic. People remember not how loudly it flew, but why it existed. It stands as a reminder that preparation can be an act of caution rather than aggression, that strength can be expressed through readiness instead of action. Few machines leave behind such a gentle echo. What ultimately lingers is not the aircraft's size, nor the complexity of its engines, nor even its place in strategic doctrine. What lingers is the realization that technology always carries the intentions of those who build it. The B-36 was forged from aluminum and magnesium, but also from anxiety, hope, and a collective desire to avoid repeating the devastation of global war. Its structure was physical, its purpose was emotional. That combination is what allows it to remain vivid long after its last flight has vanished into the past. As time stretches further, the Peacemaker becomes less a chapter in aviation and more a quiet lesson in balance. It shows that progress is not only about moving forward faster or reaching farther, but about understanding the consequences that come with those abilities. In a world that often measures success by speed and spectacle, the B-36 offers a different measure: the value of restraint, the power of presence, the strength found in choosing not to act when action could change everything irreversibly. And so its story does not end with metal resting in museums or with dates printed in history books. It ends in the subtle space where memory meets meaning. The B-36 Peacemaker remains as a silhouette across the collective imagination, vast, calm, and strangely reassuring. A giant that once filled the sky now fills reflection instead, reminding us that some creations are remembered not because they altered the world through force, but because they helped the world pause long enough to consider another path. And when even those reflections begin to soften with time, the B-36 Peacemaker settles into the deepest layer of history, the place where stories are no longer told with urgency, but with quiet understanding. It becomes less a subject and more a backdrop, like a distant skyline you no longer actively notice, yet somehow always recognize. The aircraft does not demand attention anymore. It simply exists in the collective memory as proof that such a thing once took shape, lifted itself into the sky, and carried the weight of an era on its wings. In this final stage, the Peacemaker is no longer defined by engines, missions, or specifications. It is defined by contrast, immense in form, restrained in action, built for power, remembered for caution, designed for war, associated with peace. These opposites do not cancel each other out, they coexist, giving the aircraft a depth that few machines ever achieve. It becomes a reminder that history is rarely simple, that the most influential creations often carry paradox at their core. There is a certain calm that comes with this realization. The B-36 no longer symbolizes tension or rivalry. Instead, it represents the human capacity to pause before crossing irreversible thresholds. It speaks to the moment when societies realized that invention must be balanced with intention, that the sky was no longer just a space to conquer, but a space to consider. The bomber's legacy in this sense is not mechanical at all. It is philosophical. It asks future generations to look at their own innovations and wonder, not only can we build this, but also should we use it? As decades continue to layer themselves over the past, fewer voices will recall first-hand encounters with the aircraft. Yet the outline remains in archives, in museum halls, in passing references that spark curiosity. The B-36 becomes one of those historical silhouettes that never fully disappear. It does not dominate the narrative of aviation, but it quietly anchors it, reminding observers that the path from past to future is often paved by transitional giants who carry the uncertainty of their time with dignity. And so the story finally rests in stillness. No dramatic conclusion, no final roar of engines, no sudden disappearance. Just a gradual settling, like dusk lowering over an airfield that once echoed with thunder. The Peacemaker endures as a quiet testament to scale, restraint, and the peculiar strength found in preparedness without action. In the vast chronology of human achievement, it remains a gentle echo rather than a shout, a reminder that sometimes the most enduring legacy is not what was done, but what was carefully, deliberately held back.